My son showed up on a Sunday morning, with a folder thick enough to choke on, a smile I hadn't seen in years, and a woman beside him who looked at my house like she was already calculating square footage. I hadn't heard from him in 4 months, not since Thanksgiving, when his wife spent the whole dinner on her phone and he ate 2 plates of turkey without looking up once. So when the doorbell rang at 8:15 and I saw his pickup in the driveway, something in my chest pulled tight before I even opened the door. "Dad." He held out his arms like we talked every week. Long time. I stepped back and let them in. His wife, I'll call her what she's always been, my daughter-in-law, walked past me into the kitchen without being invited, set her purse on the counter, and looked around with the slow, deliberate attention of a real estate inspector. She was wearing a blouse that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. I noticed because my late wife would have noticed. Eleanor always had an eye for those things. "Coffee?" I asked. My son sat down at the kitchen table, set the folder in front of him and said, "We'll get right to it, Dad. We've got exciting news." The folder didn't look like exciting news. It looked like a trap. They had bought a business, a franchise, my daughter-in-law explained, sliding into the chair across from me like she owned it. A cleaning service franchise. 14 territories, projected revenue of $2.3 million in year 3. She pulled a laminated printout from the folder and placed it face up in front of me. Color graphs, pie charts. The words passive income appeared no fewer than 4 times on the first page. I looked at my son. He was watching me the way a man watches a slot machine after he's already pulled the lever. "Sounds like a real venture," I said carefully. "When did you close on this?" "Last week." My daughter-in-law tapped the printout. "We put down $80,000. That's everything we had liquid, which is why we need the rest from you." The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the way rooms do when the temperature of a conversation drops without warning. "The rest," I repeated. $240,000. My son leaned forward, elbows on the table. "It's the remaining franchise fee plus operational capital to get through the first 18 months before revenue stabilizes. We've already signed the contract, Dad. We need the money by the end of the month." I looked at my son. He was 41 years old. I had coached his Little League team. I had driven 8 hours through a February ice storm to watch him graduate. I had written a check for his wedding that I didn't cash the second mortgage to cover, but that I had saved for 3 years to afford. The man sitting at my kitchen table, with his laminated charts and his end-of-month deadline, looked like a stranger wearing my son's face. "You bought it before asking me," I said. "We knew you'd say yes." My daughter-in-law smiled. "You always support family." There it was, not a question. A statement of assumed fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who had already spent the money in her head. I poured myself a second cup of coffee I didn't need and stood at the counter for a long moment. 38 years I'd spent as an actuary for a regional insurance firm in Columbus. My entire career had been the science of calculating risk, assessing what could go wrong, how likely it was, and what it would cost. I had looked at more projection spreadsheets than most people see in a lifetime. I knew what good ones looked like, and I knew what these were. "I need to look this over," I said. "Of course." My daughter-in-law folded her hands on the table. But like Brendan said, end of month. That was the first time she'd used his name, which meant the script had moved past the part where warmth was necessary. They left 40 minutes later with a promise I hadn't made, but they'd apparently heard anyway. I watched the pickup back out of my driveway from the kitchen window. Then I carried the folder to my desk in the back bedroom, the room I'd converted into a home office after Eleanor passed, and sat down in the chair that still smelled faintly of the cedar sachets she used to tuck into the closets. I opened the folder and started reading. By 9 that evening, I had 3 pages of handwritten notes, and a feeling in my stomach like swallowing gravel. The franchise agreement was real. The company existed, but the projected numbers were built on best-case assumptions stacked on top of best-case assumptions, each one dependent on the one below it. Remove any single variable. Slower client acquisition, a competitor entering the territory, 1 bad quarter, and the $2.3 million became a loss. A substantial one. More importantly, my son and daughter-in-law had signed a contract obligating them to $240,000 they did not have, with no written agreement from me, no conversation, no ask, only the assumption. I called my college roommate, a man I'd known for 40 years who'd spent his career in commercial lending. I didn't tell him everything, just enough. Walk away, he said, before I'd finished the second sentence. If they signed without your commitment in writing, that's their contract, not yours. I know, I said. But it's my son. He was quiet for a moment. That's the part they're counting on. I didn't sleep much that night. The text started the next morning. My son first, cheerful and transactional, forwarding me the company's FAQ page. Then my daughter-in-law, a longer message about how this was the opportunity they'd been waiting for, how hard they'd both been working, how much this meant to them. Then my son again, just, Dad, we really need an answer by Friday. Friday was 4 days away. I didn't respond. Not because I was being cruel, because I wasn't ready, and I have learned in 67 years that responding before you're ready is how you end up saying things you have to spend years walking back. On Wednesday, my daughter-in-law called. When I didn't answer, she called again 20 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail both times. The second message was 40 seconds long and ended with, I just want you to know that Brendan is really hurt by your silence. He's trying to build something for this family, and you're not even willing to pick up the phone. I saved both voicemails. On Thursday, the certified letter arrived. I knew what it was before I opened it. The return address was a law firm downtown, a name I didn't recognize but that had the clean, assertive typography of an outfit that specialized in a specific kind of pressure. The letter stated that my son and his wife intended to pursue legal action for breach of oral agreement, claiming I had verbally committed over multiple years to supporting their financial goals and entrepreneurial endeavors, and that they had relied on this commitment in making the decision to purchase the franchise. $240,000, plus damages. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in my hands for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something it couldn't reach. 38 years of actuarial work had trained one habit into my brain above all others. When the situation changes, recalculate. Don't react to the emotion. Assess the new variables. Determine what the numbers actually say. What the numbers said was this. My son and his wife had spent $80,000 of their own money on a contract they couldn't complete without mine. They were now attempting to legally compel me to cover the gap by claiming promises I had never made, and they had done all of this on a timeline. End of month, Friday, certified letter, designed to overwhelm my judgment with urgency. I picked up the phone and called my doctor's golf partner, a man named Chester, who had practiced civil litigation in Ohio for 30 years. Chester and I had eaten dinner together exactly twice at the practice's holiday party. But he had given me his card at Eleanor's funeral and said, call me if you ever need anything, in a way that felt like he meant it. He answered on the second ring. When I finished explaining, he said, send me the letter tonight. I'll have someone look at it tomorrow morning. He called back the next afternoon. His associate, a younger attorney named Priya who handled elder law and civil disputes, had reviewed everything. There's no written evidence of any promise, Chester said. No emails, no texts, no signed documents. An oral contract claim of this size in Ohio requires corroboration. They'd need witnesses who heard you make these commitments. I never made them. I know. Chester's voice was dry, but they might find people willing to say otherwise. The question is whether you want to fight or whether you want this to go away. How much would it cost to make it go away? Priya estimates somewhere between 40 and 70,000 if they push hard and you settle. And if I fight, then you fight. He paused. Is the money the only consideration here? It wasn't, but I wasn't ready to say what the other consideration was. I told him to file a response. Full defense, counterclaim for frivolous litigation, the works. He said he'd have paperwork ready by Monday. That weekend, my daughter-in-law called my sister in Cincinnati. I found out because my sister called me Sunday night, equal parts confused and upset, asking what was happening and whether it was true that I'd promised to fund their business for years. My sister is 70, has a heart condition, and does not need the stress. I kept my voice level. I told her it was a legal matter I couldn't discuss. She asked 3 more times. I gave her the same answer 3 times. When I hung up, I added her name to a list I'd started in my notebook, third-party contacts. My sister was the second entry. My neighbor, who told me Monday morning that my daughter-in-law had stopped by the previous afternoon, apparently to share her side of things, was the third. They were building a record, or trying to. Priya filed the response on a Tuesday. The counterclaim accused them of filing a bad faith lawsuit to extract money through manufactured legal pressure. By Wednesday afternoon, I had a voicemail from my son that I will not describe in full except to say that the word selfish appeared twice and the word monster appeared once. Screenshot. Save. I also had, in the same 24 hours, a moment of clarity I hadn't expected. My son-in-law, my daughter's husband, a decent and steady man who'd been a structural engineer for 20 years, called to check on me. He and my daughter live in Portland and stay out of family drama, as a matter of principle, which I have always respected. But he'd heard something through the extended family network and wanted to make sure I was all right. I told him what was happening. Not everything. Enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, when Brendan and his wife were visiting us last fall, she mentioned that they were having serious money problems. Credit card debt, I think. She made it sound like it was temporary, but the number she mentioned wasn't small." "What number?" He hesitated. I probably shouldn't say secondhand, but it was significant. I thanked him and called Priya the next morning. She had a contact, a licensed investigator she used for asset research in contested estate cases. A practical, no-nonsense arrangement. She gave me the number. I called that afternoon and scheduled a meeting for Thursday. The investigator's name was Wendell. He worked out of a second-floor office above a tax preparation service in a strip mall near the airport. He had the look of a man who had spent 30 years finding things people hoped would stay lost, and who had made a complete peace with that fact. "I need to understand their financial situation," I told him. "Everything that's actually there, not what they've presented." He nodded. "Standard engagement." He quoted me a flat fee. I wrote the check. He called 11 days later and asked me to come in. The report was 12 pages. I read it at his desk while he sat across from me and drank coffee. The credit card debt was real. Combined balance across 4 cards. $61,000, accumulated over 22 months. The payment history showed minimum payments only for the last 14 months. Several late, 2 accounts flagged for collections. There was also a personal loan, private lender, not a bank, taken out 8 months ago for $18,000, currently in default. The franchise purchase had been made with the last liquid funds they had. I set the report down. They bought the franchise knowing they couldn't cover the full cost. Wendell refilled his coffee. They bought it knowing someone else would have to. I drove home slowly. The afternoon was gray and damp, late October rain, just starting to streak the windshield. I thought about my son as a 9-year-old, standing at the plate with his batting helmet too big for his head, squinting at the pitcher like he could will the ball somewhere useful. I thought about Eleanor holding his hand in the hospital the night he had his appendix out at 17. I thought about the morning I got the call that his first marriage had ended and how he'd shown up at my door at midnight and I'd made him scrambled eggs and we'd sat at this same kitchen table until 2 in the morning, not saying much, just sitting. That man and the man who'd sent me a legal demand letter were the same person. I couldn't separate them. Couldn't choose to love one and be indifferent to the other. But I also couldn't give him $240,000 I hadn't promised to cover a debt his wife had engineered, because the alternative was a lawsuit. I stopped at the pharmacy on the way home and bought a new notebook. Organized everything from the beginning: timeline, contacts, documents, the voicemails, the certified letter, the investigator's report. Every piece in order, cross-referenced, dated. Priya called the following Monday. Opposing counsel had reached out. They were now suggesting a settlement of $90,000, down from $240,000. "Tell them no," I said. She paused. "Just want to be sure you understand. If this goes to trial, I understand. Tell them no." There was a long pause. "All right, we go to trial." 3 weeks before the court date, my daughter-in-law called me from a number I didn't recognize, a blocked number, which told me she knew I wouldn't answer her regular line. I picked up out of reflex. She was crying before she finished saying my name. She talked for several minutes, about how hard things had been, about how Brendan wasn't doing well emotionally, about how this had never been meant to go this far, and maybe we could just talk, just the two of us, without lawyers. She said, "You're the only family he really has. Don't you see what you're doing to him?" I sat in my home office and listened to every word. Then I said, "Are you aware that I know about the $61,000 in credit card debt and the private loan in default?" Silence. I continued, "I know you purchased the franchise understanding you could not complete the payment without my money. I know this lawsuit was filed to compel me to cover a commitment I never made, and I have documentation of every contact attempt, every third-party outreach, and every threatening message my son left on my voicemail." Her breathing changed. "I'm going to ask you one question," I said, "and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Does Brendan know everything about your financial situation? All of it?" The silence lasted long enough that I had my answer. I ended the call, walked to my kitchen, and stood at the window for a while, watching the neighbor across the street rake leaves into a pile his dog kept scattering. An ordinary afternoon. The kind Eleanor and I used to spend doing nothing much, just existing in the same house, which turns out to be its own kind of grace. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Trial day was a Tuesday in November. The courthouse was a 30-minute drive in morning traffic. Priya met me at the security entrance looking composed in a gray suit that suggested she had done this many times and expected to do it many more. She had reviewed all materials the previous week and told me our position was strong. I had the investigator's report, the voicemails, the neighbor's statement, my sister's account of the contact attempt, and 3 years of bank records showing every financial transaction between me and my son. Birthday checks, the occasional emergency cash loan always repaid, a contribution to their first apartment that I'd given freely, with no pattern suggesting a sustained commitment of the kind they were claiming. My son and daughter-in-law were already seated at the plaintiff's table when we entered. He looked thinner than I remembered. She was staring at the table in front of her. Their attorney, a man with the practiced confidence of someone who filed these cases as a business model, was making notes. My son didn't look at me. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with the expression of someone who had heard every variation of this kind of story. She moved through the opening procedural matters efficiently, listened to the plaintiff's opening statement, which leaned heavily on emotional language about parental support, lifelong expectations, and a father's duty, without expression, and then turned to Priya. Priya presented the bank records first. Methodical, factual, no theater. Every transaction. No pattern of sustained financial support. Then the documentation of contact attempts to third parties. Then the voicemails. She played a portion of the one that used the word monster, and something shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. Then, the investigator's report. The opposing attorney objected to the financial investigation as irrelevant. Priya argued that the defendant's financial circumstances were directly relevant to the motivation for the lawsuit. The judge allowed it. When my son took the stand, he described conversations we'd had over the years, in terms that bore only a passing resemblance to conversations I actually remembered. He was calm, measured, clearly rehearsed. His wife corroborated everything from the gallery with the subtle body language of someone invested in a specific outcome. And then Priya asked him directly, "Were you aware, at the time you filed this lawsuit, of the full extent of the outstanding debt on the joint credit accounts you share with your wife?" He blinked. "Yes. All of it?" A pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. "I became aware of most of it recently." "How recently?" His attorney objected. The judge sustained it on narrow grounds, but her expression suggested she had noted the pause. The judge asked us both to submit final written arguments within 10 days and adjourned. In the hallway afterward, I watched my son walk past without speaking. My daughter-in-law kept her eyes straight ahead. Their attorney was already on his phone. Priya touched my arm briefly. That went the way it needed to. The ruling came on a Friday morning, delivered to Priya's office by email. She called me while I was on my morning walk. The lawsuit was dismissed. No evidence of enforceable oral contract. The judge found the financial circumstances of the plaintiffs relevant and noted that the lawsuit appeared to have been motivated by financial distress rather than a legitimate legal claim. She ordered them to pay my legal costs, $11,200, within 45 days. There was no criminal referral. The judge noted, in the written opinion, that the threshold for fraud required a higher standard than what had been demonstrated. But she was clear about what she'd seen. I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and listened to Priya read the relevant paragraphs. The trees in my neighbor's yard were bare, the kind of stripped clean that only comes after the last leaves finally let go. I thanked her. I told her to send me the final invoice. I stood there for another minute after we hung up, looking at nothing in particular, and then I turned and walked home. The house was quiet when I got in. I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at the space where the folder had been the first morning, when I'd still thought they'd come to patch things up. I'd won. Completely and clearly, and on the record. My savings were intact. My dignity was intact. My documentation had held up to scrutiny the way good documentation always does. And my son was somewhere across the city, owing me money he probably couldn't pay, in a marriage that had exposed its structural flaws in the worst possible venue, having purchased a business he still couldn't fund. Winning, I have discovered, feels considerably less like a destination than the word suggests. I revised my estate planning 2 weeks later, not out of anger, out of clarity. My financial planner, a steady woman I'd worked with for a decade, helped me restructure things so that my assets were directed primarily to a trust supporting adult literacy programs in Columbus, the kind my mother had used when she came to this country at 32 and needed to learn to read her lease. My son would receive a portion, not nothing, but proportionate to what the situation had earned. She asked me once, gently, if I was certain. I told her I was. The letter came in December, my son's handwriting on the envelope, which he'd always had from Eleanor, that slightly leftward tilt, the careful spacing. I stood at the mailbox and held it for a moment before going inside. He wrote 4 paragraphs. The first one said he understood what he'd done. The second one said he didn't fully understand it at the time, that his wife had driven most of the decision-making, and he had followed because he was scared, and because following felt easier than confronting. The third paragraph didn't ask for forgiveness, it just said he was sorry. The fourth said that if I was ever willing to have a cup of coffee sometime, he would come to me. I read it twice. Then I placed it in the drawer of my desk, underneath the folder I'd organized in the first week of all this. Everything in order, everything labeled, everything preserved. Not answered, not discarded. The winter settled in the way it does in Ohio. Steady and gray and long. I kept my routines. Morning walk, afternoon reading, occasional dinner with my daughter and her husband when they came through town. She never said I told you so about any of it, which is exactly the kind of person she has always been. On a Thursday in late January, I passed the coffee shop on 5th Street where my son and I used to go after his Little League games. The one with the green awning that had been there longer than the neighborhood around it had been fashionable. I stopped, on an impulse I didn't fully examine, and looked through the window at the familiar interior. Same mismatched chairs, same chalkboard menu with its handwritten specials. I went in, ordered a black coffee, sat at a corner table. I didn't call him, but I sat there for a while and thought about what I might say if I did, someday. When the distance between what happened and where we are now is wide enough to cross without either of us falling in. Some things I've learned can't be rushed, and some things, like 41 years of loving a person, even imperfectly, even through disappointment, don't disappear just because they've been tested. I finished my coffee, left a tip, and walked home in the January cold with my hands in my pockets, and the kind of quiet in my chest that isn't emptiness. It's the feeling of knowing exactly where you stand.